everybody. Welcome back to Spruverse, my scale model universe, people of Earth. Welcome to a very brief episode just to share the reveal of Davros. This is the 1/5 scale plastic model kit, supposedly plastic model, more like styrene and some resin and a few odds and ends. But this is from a company called Sevans, and they're obviously not in production anymore. This is an old kit, but it was based on a couple of emails from some very cool subscribers and obviously Doctor Who fans that reminded me that this kit was out there. And so I thought, well, why not? Let's have some fun and see if I could pick it up and just play with it. It's not a complicated build, although I think that the highlight of this kit is the sculpt for his face. And of course, they do give you the hand as well. The base is a very crude styrene base, and a lot of it is vacuform as well. So these parts are always tricky to put together. There's a lot of puttying. And while I was building this, it sort of dawned on me that I can't really not light it. Oh, you can see I put a few lights behind his brace shield in the back, and I've got 5 control switches on the main console lit up. But he's a great sculpt, and Davros was a wonderful character. And as all of you know, I don't need to tell any of you, but for some of you who are just joining for the first time, welcome. Please like and subscribe to the channel. What I wanted to say is this is one of those great examples of how the lore of Doctor Who has changed. And as we know, there was an earlier version of how the Daleks were created. And that was that sort of planetary fight between the Thals and the Dals ended up becoming the Daleks. In the television series, that was reimagined under the evil empire of Davros, a mad genius who obviously wanted to conquer the universe. And here he is. He was a very sinister character, and I think he was a great villain. So I think he certainly did his part for the television series. As most of you know, I brought back Doctor Who in '96. I executive produced the movie starring Paul McCann as the 8th Doctor. And previous to this episode, we have talked a little bit about the production and various aspects of the show, and I've answered a few questions. But I thought today it might be fun to talk a little bit about how I approached the relaunch. Because the truth is, as passionate as I was and as driven as I was to get the rights and to get it sold, once the adrenaline rush of that had passed, you realize you've got to make it. And what are you going to do, and how are you going to approach it? It's not an easy thing to sort of attack, really, because if you think about it, when I arrived on the scene, there were 760 previously produced episodes of this series. Think about that. That is unimaginable. And to be able to look at the entirety of the work and think, okay, of the canon, the character evolution and the stories behind the creatures and the monsters, what parts do you keep? What parts do you throw out? Do you throw anything out? Do you start again? Do you pick a moment in time and do you sort of retell those stories? And when you do, are you making something better or just different? And as whimsical as the original television series was, and it was produced on a very small budget, but with a lot of people who had an incredible imagination. And originally, the intent of Doctor Who back in the 60s, when Verity Lambert was the original producer, was to be an educational program. It was really an excuse to sort of talk about history and, through time travel, because you could go anywhere forwards and backwards in time and really look at the world around you. And so that was the whole reason why Doctor Who was invented. And I don't think anybody at the time had any idea how it would explode and take off. And of course, we know after William Hartnell became sick and they had to figure out how to recast him, they came up with the idea of regeneration, and the rest, as they say, is history. But this was highly creative for the time. The television writers and producers who were essentially trying to hold on to their show and make sure that it continued to thrive. And of course, as they did that, the mythology is born and it is built on, and writers come in and it grows. So that was the sort of conundrum that I was left with, because there were so many great characters that I personally thought, we're going to mine all of these creatures and monsters and mythology. We're going to obviously update it. But there was one significant key issue that I thought was very important to me, and that was scale. I wanted my production to be bigger so that the world could feel more substantial, and that for an audience in '96, they could feel like they were getting something that was a lot more filmic. And at the time, it was very important that it felt that way, because originally it was being produced under the Amblin banner for Steven Spielberg while I was at that company. So I had to really be very mindful of quality and how it would be received and perceived, not just by the creative community, but by the audience at large. One of the things that I was first tasked with was finding a writer to partner with me and work on the idea. And I also needed what is termed as a showrunner. That's the person who's actually going to be with the production on a day-to-day basis. So in the form of the showrunner, I actually hired Peter Wag because I really loved the way he was involved with the creation of Max Headroom. And it had that really sort of otherworldly kind of feel to it. It was fresh, but what you were able to do was immerse yourself in that world, relate to the characters, and feel like you were welcome. And so that was very important to me, that if this was going to go to series, that we had someone who was going to take care of the show. Because at some point I was concerned that my job was just too big for me to be able to stay on Doctor Who full time, because at the time I was developing and creating Sequest and Earth 2 and ER, and so there was an awful lot going on at the time. And so curiously, the studio who partnered with us on everything at Amblin was Universal. That's where our home was. And they introduced us to John Leakley, who was a very successful, talented writer who was very passionate about the project and wanted to give it a crack. And so off we went. And it was then that I brought on Richard Lewis. Now, I had first worked with Richard because when I was at ABC, he was involved in some other productions, and I got to know his work, and we became friends. When I came to Amblin, the first thing we actually did together was a Civil War movie called The Class of '61. And it was during that time that I knew I was getting close to getting Doctor Who off the ground, and asked him to come on board and create a Bible for the purpose of sharing this wonderful story of Doctor Who with television executives. As always, I always try to make it as creative and as fun as possible. And so to that end, we came up with this. Now, what this is what we refer to as the Bible. And what we have on the front here, we lovingly refer to as Cardinal Barussa's symbol. I first saw this on a Tom Baker episode of Doctor Who. So that is what we copied. The actual book itself is made of lambskin, and it's all hand cut. This symbol was digitally pressed into the leather, and they were hand bound and produced on a wonderful parchment paper. And the original presentation was called The Chronicles of Doctor Who, with a big question mark. It starts off with a wonderful story in which Cardinal Barussa explains who he is. He's a Time Lord of Gallifrey, and what is Gallifrey. And this is how the story begins. And we get into a lot of the details about the backstory of the Doctor's home planet. Now, this is where it gets really interesting because we are filling in parts of the story that perhaps we didn't really have a lot of information about. We certainly tried to take an awful lot of what we learned about Gallifrey from the Tom Baker years and try to put this into the fabric of our storytelling. And curiously enough, as I was going around from network to network trying to sell this, it became patently obvious to me that Tom Baker was the Doctor that everybody knew from PBS. It was still running on PBS at that time for a little bit. And so they had seen that particular Doctor. And I always thought that that was curious. So the other thing that this does, which drove a lot of people crazy, it gets into the idea that the Doctor is half human. And for a lot of Whovians, this was just blasphemy. But again, what we were trying to do was ground it for an American audience and for a world audience, obviously, but primarily for an American sale, because without the US sale, there wasn't going to be Doctor Who. So it was really important that I find a way to bridge that gap, that sort of cultural bridge, I should say, from one continent to another, and try to sort of give it some context. We also put in here an interesting scene between the Doctor and Cardinal Barusa. This talks about repairing the dematerialization circuit, the chameleon device for the TARDIS, because we were trying to see whether or not we could play with the notion of it sometimes being a police box and sometimes being something else. But obviously that notion would have been removed. So we get through some scene work with the Doctor and Cardinal Barusa, which really kinds of sort of explains what's going on in the universe and who the Doctor is, and that stays pretty close to the lore of Doctor Who. And then we get into some of the villains and characters that he knows or would meet along the way. And obviously the Master was one of them. And so we certainly talked about the Master. We also talked about the tomb of Rassilon. And the idea is that this was a place of sanctuary, a spiritual place that was part of the fabric of the Gallifreyan society. Think of it as the Senate. We really talked about the fact that the Doctor has many enemies, and of course the Daleks would have been one of them. I've shown those designs on my Instagram account, and I've also put them up in a previous episode here, but I'll do it again. And it goes through the TARDIS and explains what the TARDIS is and how the TARDIS works. And it has some photos of the TARDIS itself, just some sketches that we had created. We go into the Daleks themselves, they're from Skaro, and we even have, look at this, a picture of Davros, who would have been part of the fabric of our show. Isn't that interesting? And that's why I wanted to bring out this journal today, is because I think there's a wonderful connection here. It's neat for me to be able to come full circle and share some of these things with you, because I had a great time reimagining what Doctor Who could be. We also get into a couple of interesting stories, and some we actually picked off from the original series, if you can imagine. We talk about the Talons of One Cheyenne, which would have been a great remake because it was such a really smart and beautifully produced story, I thought. We also talk about the Cybermen. There's a lot of fun that we were going to have with the Cybermen. We put in here a lot of stories that had very familiar titles. It was a very easy way for us to connect with the original series. It was familiar to the people on the British side of the equation, but it was obviously fresh and original for those who had never seen the television series. And that was the key here. It was hopefully to not only embrace the fans of the show that we had, but it was also to hopefully engage a new audience. We had a story called Ark in Space. You'll know that that's very familiar. And so we go on to the real reason why this really exists. And this is the page that we really wanted these network executives to really lock into. That was the fact that it was the longest running science fiction in history, and it spanned 30 years, that there were 650 produced episodes. And it was seen in 88 countries around the world. And it had an estimated world audience of 150 million viewers. And at the time, that was huge. There were over 126 licensed merchandise lines at the time. There'd been 125 novels published about the Doctor. And a Doctor Who convention was held every week somewhere in the world at that time. Isn't that amazing? It was that, and then some really colorful photos at the end here of what we thought the world would look like. A photo of the Master, a wonderful blueprint of what the TARDIS interior would look like. And we didn't actually stray that far from this. An imagining of the TARDIS console room. This was sent up to Richard Houdolan in Vancouver. He really did a wonderful job of taking what we had imagined, keeping close to it. Here's a really fun picture that I've always liked. This idea of this very kind of Victoriana interior with lots of wood and very organic sort of things, very timeless. Here's a picture that I always thought was so whimsical of the TARDIS landing in a unicorn. I always thought that that was a great image. Here are the Daleks themselves. Here are the Cybermen, or as we called them, the Cybes of Mondas. But if you look really closely at these faces, you can see there's a real mechanical kind of rigidness to it that I think plays really well. A photo here of Ark in space. This notice that it was coming from Amblin Television, Universal Television, and the BBC. And then the last page, obviously, is credit to John Leakley, Peter Wagg and myself, Richard Lewis as the production designer, and then Matthew Codd and Trevor Goring for all their hard work doing the illustrations. And at the time, I had an assistant, Jesse, who I gave a little heads up to, a little thank you to. And that was it. Here it is. This is it. I had made probably about 25 to 30 of these. I know there's some in private hands, but I don't know where the rest of them are. But this one is safe here with me. And so that's a quick look at the Davros build from Sevans, a brief overview of how this all started. The only other thing I would like to say before we close this is that I've really enjoyed over the years seeing how the community and the fans have embraced Paul McGann and celebrating him as the 8th Doctor. In fact, so much so that I want to give a shout out to a group called the 8th Doctor Appreciation Society on Facebook. Check them out. Join them if you want to. They're a great group, and they are genuinely the keepers of the flame for the Paul McGann 8th Doctor, in my opinion. It was wonderful to see this, and it was a real pleasure to join. So I just wanted to give them a shout out and thank them for continuing to carry the flame, because not just Paul, but Dana as well, really looked back on that time as something that they will cherish for the rest of their lives. That means an awful lot to me as a producer, because oftentimes those can be negative experiences. And Sylvester McCoy as well. What a gentleman. What a just a wonderful human being. And it was such an honor to have him also regenerate as he should have. And that was something that was very important to me. So that's it. Just a brief time out from building models, although I did construct this one behind the scenes just to sort of talk a little more about Doctor Who. So thank you for being a part of my channel, and thank you for please liking and subscribing, and tell your friends. I'm really trying to build the channel, and with your help, I can do that. And that would mean an awful lot to me, because it's a community. This hobby of mine is very important to me, and it's going to be a big part of the 3rd chapter in my life. So until next time, everybody, be safe, be well, build something, and I'll see you next time. Take care, everybody. Exterminated! I'm exterminated! I'm exterminated! Exterminate them! Exterminate!
Exterminate! Exterminate! Exterminate! Exterminate! Exterminate! Exterminate! Exterminate!